Hey everybody. Welcome to Rage Quit podcast for the young and politically minded. Today's guest is Dr. Stark Harbor. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Uh, yes, hello. My name is Stark Harbor. I'm uh, adjunct professor of history at Shepherd University, and I'm currently a doctoral candidate at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, formerly of University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where I received my master's, and a Shepherd alum, class of 2017 for my bachelor.
Cool. Cool. All right. So today's episode is, of course, on labor unions. And it was funny because I planned this before you even taught it in class. So I was like, whoa, you should be on my show. All right, without further ado, so this is a podcast for students at Shepherd, not necessarily Shepherd, but just university and to begin with. And at this day and age, labor unions aren't as pervasive as they once were and as powerful as they once were. So a lot of people may not know the history of labor unions, for one. So can you tell us what they do and how they started in America, like their origins?
Sure. So labor unions in the United States are kind of unique. Labor unionism has a very strong tradition in Europe and in other parts of the world, but the United States and its emphasis on free enterprise and unfettered capitalism kind of made labor unions antithetical to the American business model. So as early as really the founding of the United States and even before in the colonial period, you had things like guilds that kind of served um, certain industries as what we would come to know labor unions to do, organization of members and setting, standard practices across the board, but also things like, safety and pay, and then eventually, benefits and pensions and things like that. But as it grew in the United States, and especially the birth of the labor union, really after the Civil War, begins the push for unionism in the United States, because of the rapid industrialization of the specifically the Northeast United States, and the United States transitioning from an agrarian based economy to one that is based on uh, wage labor in factories and heavy industries. Yeah.
Mhm. Okay. Uh, so after the post World War II years, these are known as the golden age of the economy, as in highest wages, best working conditions, yada yada yada. Um, and this was at the same time labor unions were at their strongest. Do you think that this was a coincidence that labor unions were at their strongest when wages were at the highest? Do you think that played a small part, a big part, or no part at all in the post-war Gilded Age?
Well, I think a couple of things. I think first off, that labor unions enjoyed a lot of success in the post World War II era, because of their alliance with other groups that formed the New Deal coalition.
Mm-hmm.
FDR really appreciated, and the Democratic Party came to appreciate labor unions and the way that they could um, deliver votes consistently to the party that advocated for uh, labor unions and the proliferation of unionism in the United States into new industries. And I think that it is not a coincidence that wages, high wages in the post World War II years correlate with the, really the crest of labor unionism in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was very much coordinated by the government, the Democratic administrations of FDR and then Truman,
Mm-hmm.
and then Eisenhower, Republican, but then Kennedy again, a Democrat. And I think that wages being high like that made workers happy with their unions, and really showed them that their work was valued, even if it was something like what we would today consider blue collar work. But in the post World War II years, blue collar work was sufficient to take care of your family,
Mm-hmm.
and unions were seen as a really an important like community measure for workers to have, to go to in cases where they needed to address things like safety or benefits or pay increases.
Uh, to go off that question some more, um, what do you think it was like for like, because when we think of workers at this time in labor unions, we think of predominantly white uh labor workers. Um, one were trade unions, were they tolerant of black workers or just ethnic workers, women workers? And did they have their own uh labor unions? And yeah, can you just go off that real quick?
Sure, yeah.
Mm,
So that's an interesting question, and it's got some history behind it. So in the post Civil War years, we talk
mhm,
about postbellum, specifically the 1870s and then into the 1880s and 1890s, populism was on the rise in the United States.
mhm,
And among the issues at play with populism was a proposed partnership between white and black sharecroppers, basically unionizing the sharecropping industry, which was a
mhm,
huge industry that would have dramatically reshaped the American South and Midwest by
mhm,
connecting black and white farmers into this. The Grange and the Farmers Alliance were the organizations that were trying to do this,
mhm,
and it broke down largely along because of racial intolerance
mhm,
by political leaders in the South, Democratic political leaders in the South.
mhm,
And it was really a missed opportunity because that was a grassroots um, push by black and white farmers who were neighbors who knew each other,
mhm,
to come together and form um, a union, and would have been probably unique in the annals of labor history, both in this country and abroad, of
mhm.
cooperation across racial lines for the benefit of all.
Okay.
But I think I'm sorry. What were the other parts of
Was,
your question?
are there any black, like only maybe black only labor unions at the time?
Um, so yeah, there were,
Mhm,
because African Americans did particular jobs
mhm,
that no other group would do. So a big one would be like dock workers.
mhm,
Dock workers like in the American South, specifically like New Orleans, Mobile, Pensacola. Um, the people who loaded and unloaded those ships were primarily African American,
mhm,
and manual labor, and the um, kind of natural synergy between manual labor and what African Americans were thrown into as far as jobs that they could get and were acceptable for white people for them to do.
mhm,
Um, it would be manual labor would be chief among those, if not the top choice.
mhm,
So there were unions, but their political influence was limited because what would be required is representation in Congress. And really into the mid part of the 20th century, there were very, very few um, black congressmen or senators. Really the height of black congressmen and senators before the 1960s civil
mhm,
rights movement was the governments that were installed under military control of the South at the end of the Civil War and the beginning of Reconstruction.
Hmm.
That so between Reconstruction and the Civil Rights Movement, which is almost 100 years, there was very, if any, representation for these workers in Congress, people who could support them. I'm not saying that no one did, but it was harder for them to get things done than some of the bigger um, majority white unions. And some unions did not have rules about race.
Okay.
Um, I'm thinking particularly of um, the AFL-CIO.
Hmm.
I think the CIO, which they used to be two different organizations, and
Yes.
they
Hmm.
merged, but the CIO had Black membership and was pretty open to it.
Hmm.
And but then there were unions that were really explicitly white only,
Yeah.
or white ethnic only. So
Hmm.
like the United Auto Workers Union, UAW, they were pretty strongly Caucasian unions, and the furthest diversity they really got was like Irish or Polish or Jewish uh, workers on the shop floor,
Okay.
on the floor um, assembly lines. And they in this during the civil rights movement of the 1960s is when a lot of these unions then started to open up towards um, Black membership,
Hmm.
because of the growing demographics um, in the North and the Upper Midwest. The Steel Belt, which was then at that time in transition to the Rust Belt. That numbers of African Americans were increasing rapidly in those cities as they left the South in the post-war years,
Hmm.
and this made the labor pool um, eventually majority African American, and so the unions kind of had no choice and had to start hiring African Americans, not
Yeah.
because they were being progressive, but because there
Hmm.
just was white flight from these upper Midwest cities, particularly,
Hmm.
and African Americans filled in, and so that's really how the unions broke the color barrier. It's not really a hopeful story. It's kind of a
Yeah.
story of cold realities and intolerance.
Yeah. I'm gonna get to a question where unions were not being too progressive, but I'm gonna go one last question on this issue.
Sure.
Um, so of course the Southeast is probably the least unionized part of the country. Do you
Mhm.
think that's because of race?
Um, I think race plays a large part of it. So I think
Mhm.
that the South is considered, or a lot of the South is considered right to work states, is what they call it. It's
Yes.
terminology, but basically it's opting out of union representation that they encourage by promising benefits or promising to create infrastructure in the company to mediate disputes between employees and employers,
Hmm.
or management and workers. And so they think they if they provide all of the machinery that a union would have, even if it's controlled ultimately by the corporation, that
Hmm.
will satisfy the workers. But again, the majority of the workers in the American Southeast, um, in a lot of these industries that are unionized, heavy industry or manufacturing, um, are African American,
Hmm.
because of the way that the kind of socioeconomic ladder is set up. Um, those jobs are mostly populated by African Americans, and so it's not technically about race, because it's about really preventing unionization and lost revenue and having to deal with unions. But it
Hmm.
is kind of about race in that the majority of the people that they're dealing with are one particular ethnic group, African Americans, and now starting to develop a lot of Hispanic populations in urban centers, and even now into some of the more suburban and rural centers in the South.
Hmm.
So the demographics of workers are changing to be more diverse, and I think that that will be a big component in the future of labor
Hmm.
between workers and management in the South, in the American Southeast. Yeah.
Okay, cool. I like how you mentioned the Hispanic Hispanic workers like post maybe 60s, right? When
Mhm.
so because I'm planning to do this podcast after college, so I'm really liking it. So I'm thinking about doing like a whole separate episode on Cesar Chavez, but that's for
Mhm.
another. All right. Anyways, why was it that in the 60s many like union members were very like the hard hat, I think they call them hard hat Democrats. So
Yep.
they were union, but because they were more conservative, like socially, and they were supportive of the Vietnam War and like very hippie. Why was that?
So I believe what you're referring to is like the New York Construction Workers Union,
Hmm.
that were where that they were called. Yes, they were called the Hard Hat Democrats,
Hmm.
and they really had a fundamental problem the um, with the counterculture of the '60s, the hippies that you mentioned,
Hmm.
and I part of that has to do with class. So a lot of the people who comprise the counterculture are children of the World War II generation,
Hmm.
and the people who are working in this construction job, they're also children of the World War II generation, but they largely come from the the working class,
Hmm.
whereas a lot of the counterculture membership comes from the middle class.
Okay.
You know, the children of this World War II generation grew up, you know, in the at the pinnacle of American supremacy worldwide, and especially, you know, the mass consumerism and, you know, middle class aesthetic that was created really in the late 40s and 50s. And so the hard hat Democrats really took issue with the privilege that these counterculture members enjoyed, and the fact
Hmm.
that they were largely not being um, drafted and sent to war because they were being able to get deferments for participating in university. You know, school was a great way to not have to be involved with the Vietnam War, and working class kids of those construction workers were, and them they themselves, they weren't going to get that opportunity,
Hmm.
because this was a time when not everyone when college was not nearly as ubiquitous and required for work as it is now. And so they really took umbrage with the privilege and kind of um, the uh, rhetoric of the counterculture, because a lot of the social issues that the countercultural took up were anathema to working class Americans who are, you know, largely religious and, you know, fiscally conservative and certainly socially cautious of a lot of the policies that counterculture members advocated for, you know, free love, drug legalization, and the dissolution of, you know, religion's influence on American politics, and really the shift in American politics from um, supporting, you know, your neighborhood or your race or all these, you know, hard borders, and kind of the counterculture's desire to dissolve all those borders and kind of have one collective, you know, American populace that was not divided by all these categories.
Hmm.
So I think that the hardhead Democrats really just didn't they didn't like what they were saying, and they certainly didn't like the fact that they um, really didn't have to put their money where their mouth was in terms
Hmm.
of actions against the Vietnam War, because they weren't going in large numbers.
How did these hard hat Democrats vote in, what would that be, a 68 election? Did they vote Nixon or did they vote Humphrey?
So Humphrey was supported by pretty much all of the establishment rank and file of the labor unions, the upper Midwest labor unions,
Hmm.
like UAW, you know, the mine workers, yes, the construction workers union in New York.
Hmm.
He really was able to capture all of the labor unions, but the reason really that he's not president is because of LBJ's decision in 64 and 65 to try and pass civil rights legislation, the
Mm-hmm.
Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act,
Okay.
because that tore apart the coalition, at least the southern part of the coalition. When Southern segregationist leaders
Mm-hmm.
um, walked out basically on LBJ
Mm-hmm.
in 64 and 65, it splintered the Democratic Party, and it wasn't, even with all the labor union votes, it wasn't able to make up that shortfall that
Mm-hmm.
Nixon picked up basically from um, those, really the majority of Southern Democrats who had to pick between Nixon, a former vice president to Eisenhower, or Wallace, who was, an ardent segregationist and was not going to receive national, acceptance by voters who weren't in the South.
Mm-hmm.
No one's going to vote for a segregationist for president if they don't live in areas that are segregated.
Yeah.
So the smart people among the Southern Democrats then jumped ship and went to Nixon, but it was really the South, as opposed to any problems with particular labor unions like the New York construction workers. They voted how their uh, representatives, their Teamsters unions representatives told them to vote, and so they voted Democrat.
Voted Democrat still. Okay.
Yeah.
Um, so when do you think was the first domino to fall in the dominance of unions? It can be like a big one or one no one really talks about. And was it avoidable?
Yeah. Well, a lot of my knowledge about this comes
Mhm.
from a book called Last Days of the American Working Class by Jefferson Cowie. And it's
Okay.
kind of it's an economic history, but it's also got a lot of social and cultural history in it as well.
Mm-hmm.
But he argued that really labor unions were already in decline after World War II,
Mm.
because there was no longer a war, and labor unions no longer had leverage. If the labor unions had decided to strike for working conditions during World War II,
Mm-hmm.
it would have affected the fabric of American democracy,
Yeah.
because the war material that helped the Allies win would not be made.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why they passed the Wagner Act, to basically codify uh, what labor unions could and couldn't do, and prevent wildcat strikes, which are strikes that are undertaken without express permission from the leadership of the union.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so Cowie basically posits that labor unions, as soon as they lost the leverage of being able to, absolutely stop the American war industry,
Mm-hmm.
they really lost their ability to make long-term changes and kind of enshrine themselves as something that couldn't be dislodged from the American consciousness, participation in unions. As for me,
Mm-hmm.
I think that really the crux of the labor unions problems were social issues.
Social issues. Okay.
Women entering the workforce and unionizing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, the entrance of African Americans into a lot of those upper Midwest labor unions, which are very, very strong and very active unions. Um, and then this growing divide amongst, you mentioned the hard hat Democrats and the hippies, the counterculture.
Mm-hmm.
All of these social pressures, uh, when piled together, just really highlighted the difference between the generation that had fought for the creation of unions and the strengthening of unions up through World War II, and the generation that inherited those very strong bonds and kind of sat on their laurels and
Mm-hmm.
didn't really try to push the um, the goal of unionism forward and kind of stagnated, and that caused, I think, um, business interests to be able to have time and generate kind of a strategy of how they would disrupt unions and unions hold on um, American workers writ large.
Oh, okay. So you'll argue that it was mostly internal, the destruction of unions.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Um, Next question is on Reagan.
Okay.
So,
Jumping forward a little
many.
bit.
What's that?
I said jumping forward a little bit. Now we're in
Yeah, I
the
know.
80s.
Yeah,
Okay.
sorry about that.
No, it's okay.
Okay. So on Reagan, this is seen as the last stand of the New Deal coalition, like New Deal Democrats, and he's seen as what we have now, like post New Deal coalition kind of Democrat. Well, of course he was Republican, but you know what I mean. Like many of the uh it was probably, many people argue, the beginning of what parties look like now. But anyways, that's besides the point. He was seen as the most anti-union, as one of the first like openly anti-union presidents since before FDR. Um, well, first off, can you first explain briefly the New Deal coalition?
Oh yeah, sure, absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, I'll define my terms here.
Yeah.
Yeah, the New Deal coalition is this absolutely massive collection of different special interest groups
Hmm.
um, that FDR corralled into his party, the Democratic Party, and
Hmm.
promised them um, a place at the table, basically under an administration with FDR. And
Hmm.
so, just to name a few, you would have like here in West Virginia, we would have the coal miners, the United Mine Workers,
Hmm.
would be involved, would be considered in this coalition. You would have construction workers in New York. Yep. You would have um, pilots for pilots for boats navigating the intercoastal waterways on these large cargo ships. You would have out west. You would have uh, some manufacturing, textiles, women coming in. By the 80s, women had really penetrated a lot of unions
Hmm.
and had their own unions, all women unions, specifically
Really?
like what we call today administrative assistants, but back
Hmm.
then secretaries,
Okay.
and women who worked in textile sewing,
Hmm.
and then you would mention Chavez, his push to really recognize Chicanos and their work on in agriculture in California.
Hmm.
Um, all these groups in labor are part of the New Deal coalition, but then also in the New Deal coalition, you have Northeast elites of the upper class, not middle class, but upper class,
Hmm.
and American the American South and segregationists, because FDR promised not to meddle in the affairs of the American South. So the perpetuation of Jim Crow is
Hmm.
also in large part due to the New Deal coalition and
Hmm.
everyone and FDR really kind of holding serve and trying to give a little bit to all of these groups that not would not necessarily be allies under any other circumstances.
Hmm. Okay.
So that's the New Deal coalition.
Okay. Yeah, I just, because we kept talking about like coalitions beforehand. I just wanted to like,
Sure, yeah, it's
yeah, let
important
the
we
audience
know what we're
know
talking about.
exactly
Yeah.
what we're talking about. Yes. But anyways, back to Reagan. What do you think was his most anti-union thing he did as president?
So yeah, I have a perfect analogy for this, or a perfect
Hmm.
example of this.
Okay.
But I would mention that Reagan really took a lot of his political ideology from Barry Goldwater.
Hmm.
He had been involved in the Goldwater campaign back in the 60s, 64, for
Hmm.
example, and LBJ's kind of famous political advertisement with the child, pulling on the daisy, and then the nuclear explosion,
Mhm.
basically promising that a Goldwater presidency would lead to war with the Soviet Union,
Yes.
which scared a lot of Americans. It was a very controversial political
Mhm.
advertisement. But Reagan came out of that um, election cycle kind of with an idea, with a blueprint on how he would maneuver himself into the White House, and he really played on this grassroots organization populism,
Mhm.
and promising kind of to get America back to, oh, the days, when we had honest people who just said it like it was in the in the White House, which uh a little spoiler, no one ever did that.
Mhm.
Even the founding fathers you know weren't talking plainly with people. They always kind of hid their agendas to a certain degree. But I think for Reagan, on his issues with labor, the biggest one that I can think of is his handling of the strike by the flight controllers.
Mhm.
These are men and women that basically run the um, the air lanes that airlines use in the United States to move their passenger planes around, and it's a very
Mhm.
important job, and it requires a lot of skill to safely navigate and you know alert pilots and have them change course to avoid collisions and accidents. And that's why accidents are so rare in air travel, largely because of the skill and dedication of those flight controllers.
Mhm.
So with all that skill and all that expertise that comes with them, also means that they would be very hard to replace
Mhm.
if they suddenly striked. You would not be able to hire strike breakers, or scabs as they're colloquially called, to
Yes.
come in and do that work, because that's so specialized. And
Mhm.
so when Reagan was faced with this possibility that he would um, either have to allow the flight comptrollers to unionize, which he did not want to do, and his backers in corporate America did not want to do,
Mhm.
or he could make an example of them and maybe take some heat in the short term,
Mhm.
but really establish himself as far as what his beliefs are. And so he basically fired the majority of the flight comptrollers, and a lot of them were hired back. But the upshot of it was that it
Mhm.
kind of knocked them out of their pensions and all their 401ks, and kind of really upset the apple cart of their jobs. But
Mhm.
more so than that, it showed that Ronald Reagan was a person who is not going to negotiate with unions. And
Mhm.
presidents before him, Republican presidents included,
Mhm.
had negotiated with unions. Nixon negotiated with unions. Eisenhower, big proponent of cooperation with unions. Ronald Reagan and presidents going forward from Ronald Reagan really took the hint that that working across the aisle, that we're still having issues with now,
Uh-huh.
major issues,
Mhm.
um, should not be involved with unions and with labor, and that is really a no-go or a non-starter for Republicans when they're having conversations about um, things like unionization, or participation in unions for government sector jobs, as well
Mhm.
as the private sector.
Okay. Uh, a quick little aside antidote, but I remember I was listening to, it was like hardcore history podcast, Dan
Hmm.
Carlin. This is maybe my freshman year of college, and I was learning about this, and I was kind of shocked to know that like the public were either split or they were slightly on the side of Reagan. And it's funny you mentioned the Wagner Act as the downfall of unions. before you told me that, I would have said this was the downfall of labor unions in
Mm,
America. The fact that so many Americans would be pro management. And it seems like 30, if this happened 30 years before, it would have been the other way around. But I guess with Reagan's um, charisma, I guess his the circumstances around him, because I can do like a whole episode on why I don't like Reagan, but
right.
I could be here all day talking about him, but that's not the point of the episode. I might even
Mhm.
have to do a separate episode on Ronald Reagan. Okay.
Okay, can I stop you just 1 second?
Yes.
I think that I think that you're right that this is a pivotal moment in labor history with Reagan
Hmm.
and the flight comptrollers. Um, and I think that the reason that Americans were largely on the side of Reagan in this case
Hmm.
um, was because he was what he was promising in his administration
Hmm.
was the basically the streamlining of government. He's famous for saying government is the problem, government is not a solution, and that we should look to ourselves, the private sector, to come
Hmm.
up with solutions to a lot of problems, because more government regulations, more bureaucratic rigmarole that people have to go through, the worse the country functions. And that's why Jimmy Carter's administration had been so bad, because he had been a creature that really relied on all of the regulation and all of the bureaucracy that Democrats are kind of known for.
Hmm.
And so, Republicans, business, and kind of promising like, oh, we're going to return to a simpler time. And that was kind of him putting his money where his mouth was. And so
Hmm.
the American public saw him do that and be decisive and kind of said, yeah, I mean, this seems like a rational decision. He's not going to be held hostage by a union. And so that's kind of, I think, the reason that people latched on to him and supported him in this decision, despite the fact that it could have been disastrous, if all those comptrollers had indeed been fired and then could not
Yeah.
be rehired, and we had a
Hmm.
shortage of comptrollers.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. It like okay, so it's just this is gonna be revisionist for me because I wasn't in the 80s. So,
Sure.
and you're not an old man. You're probably born like the 90s. So
I was born in 1990. Yeah. So
okay.
I missed
Yeah.
out on the 80s.
Yeah. So so I guess it's easy for me to say now, looking back, why I would be upset at the Americans then. Yes, because I feel like when he did that after the Reagan administration, I feel like the role of the executive or the government as a whole is just to stand back. And back then it was, it's funny because John F. Kennedy said, ask not what you can do for your country with the country, da da da. But I
Mhm.
feel like back then Americans had a certain sense of expecting the government to actually do something for to help them. And after the Reagan administration, if a government agency is seen as like a bad thing, when during the New Deal administration, it was our New Deal era, it was seen as the government. Of course, you pay for the government, you pay taxes, so the government is going to help you. And after the Reagan administration, that like blew up in its face. Um, I'm not really agreeing or disagreeing with you. I'm just adding.
No, no, I
Yeah.
I think you really hit on it, because
Mhm.
you know Americans' view on government and the role of government
Mhm.
has changed significantly and kind of seesawed. You
Mhm.
mentioned the New Deal. The the government response to the New Deal basically created a generation of Americans that said government, helped us out of the depression.
Mhm.
So government, should be able to help us with all sorts of issues. And they had no problem with it. You're absolutely right.
Mhm.
Americans in the post-war had no problem with the government being involved in all kinds of things. And Reagan and his ideologies, going back to Goldwater and
Mhm.
people before him, and the advocation of of limited government was
Mm-hmm.
very appealing to business owners because it meant what came with it was supply side economics, which is a theory about tax cuts at the
Mm-hmm.
top, and that therefore people at the top will spend more money, and that money will trickle down to people further down.
Mm-hmm.
I would add that theory has been debunked so
Yes.
many times.
Yeah.
Freakonomics pretty famously took it apart at an
Mhm.
almost molecular level. But I think that yes, going forward from the Reagan administration, you're right that Americans said that government shouldn't be involved in all kinds of things.
Mhm.
Shouldn't be involved with abortion. Shouldn't be involved with healthcare. Shouldn't be involved with schooling and education, and kind of taking a step back from that, and all kinds of things. And really, they didn't even get a lot of the things they wanted to, you know, eliminate the government from. They
Mhm.
would have really stripped the government down to almost libertarian levels of government involvement, which is basically, unless there's a catastrophe, the government doesn't do anything and you're on your own.
Mhm.
Um, but I think there's this one caveat, and that is 9/11.
Mhm.
And George W. Bush, coming, on the heels of Reagan and then his father, George H.W. Bush, saw a massive increase in government and in legislation that allows the government to do things. Now, this is mostly on surveillance, but I mean, really, the creation of a lot of uh, programs like DHS, Department of Homeland Security, a
Mhm.
massive organization that was basically created from nothing after 9/11. And so government is kind of psychopathic now, because Republicans do still advocate for limited government, but
Yes.
they really don't on certain issues, mainly defense
Mhm.
and domestic surveillance and domestic law enforcement, and that kind of um, militarization of law enforcement, and um, you know an increase in spending on the military, despite the fact that there's no major threat to the United States
Mhm.
outside of China. And so right now it's a very interesting time, because they continue to advocate this limited government,
Mhm.
but the receipts do not
Yeah.
show that they are actually in fact practicing limited government. I mean, Donald Trump has far surpassed even Barack Obama, who
Mhm.
had spent a ton of money to get us out of the 2008 financial crisis on COVID and COVID
Mhm.
relief. And so, and Donald Trump basically got elected on, I'm going to run America like a business. And one thing you don't do in business is put yourself in massive amounts of debt, because it makes it incredibly hard for your business to be successful.
Yes. Okay. All right. Uh, I have another aside, but I don't know if I should even get to that because we got to get back on labor unions.
Okay.
Uh, I feel like I don't know. I don't know. I'm just having. This is a good talk right now. So
You want to talk about it? I will talk about
yes.
anything you want to, man.
Um. So we were talking about Reagan at first, but I
Hmm.
was gonna say I think the first, because Goldwater, of course, he ran for president. He was never president. The
That's
first
fair.
modern Republican president is Richard Nixon,
Hmm.
because he I think Reagan's kind of dumb and Rick Nixon's really smart, because I feel
Yeah.
like Reagan was just the face of corporation backing, and then he's charismatic and he's smart. So, well, not smart. He's charismatic, and he had like the he had kind of like what Trump has. He can kind of read the room and know what to say.
Hmm.
Um, Nixon, he knew that. I think he understood that American manufacturing and American labor power was declining. Therefore, he knew that he didn't have to do the New Deal stuff, New Deal era stuff, even though he did do government programs like the EPA, yada
Hmm.
yada. But anyways, I think he was smart enough to know that there is so much racial anxiety even amongst labor unions, like we talked about, the hard hat Democrats and the hippies, so much social and racial anxiety that he exploited that. Um, and then Reagan just took that and then put the new fear of the government and added that as one part, as one like brand, conservative brand.
Mhm.
And he was maybe not smart enough, because I think there's people in his ear that telling him to do, to be the
Yeah.
face of this new brand of conservatism. And I see a lot of comparisons from 2016 election and I think the 1980 election of Reagan.
Yeah.
Like they were both harkening back to a time. But honestly, I would say it was more impressive with Reagan when he won, because Reagan, he became president at the end of this New Deal era of um, um, trust in the government, whatever, like yada yada. And he had to come and he had to destroy that. So he had to like weave the narrative of bad government and social issues and why it's okay to do tax breaks for rich people, even though that would have been insane like a couple years back before
Mhm.
that. But Trump, everything was already destroyed. There's no such thing as labor unions as there was like in the 70s and 60s. And he just went off straight off racial animus. So, okay, where was I going with this?
I don't know, but you're making a lot of good points. I mean, you mentioned you mentioned Trump and he's not having to deal with labor unions,
Hmm.
but Donald Trump enjoys massive support amongst people in the mining industry, like workers in the mining industry,
Hmm.
that are like systematically oppressed by their management systems,
Yes.
uh, and the dissolution of their unions and Donald
Hmm.
Trump. But the membership of the unions supports Donald Trump because they think he's authentic and they think he's in their corner. When in
Hmm.
fact, Donald Trump could not be more pro-business,
Yes.
um, and more anti-labor unions, which mine workers really need because of the
Hmm.
nature of their jobs and its danger. Um, and you mentioned Reagan and kind of, yes, putting this face to the new right and the policies of the new right,
Hmm.
um, and the difference between Reagan, who's kind of just a brand ambassador, and
Hmm.
somebody like Nixon, who's a political creature and
Yes.
just keeps finding a way to weasel his way into positions of power. And Nixon is a very unique American president because of his ties to the New Deal coalition. He
Hmm.
when he was vice president under Eisenhower,
Hmm.
the, Eisenhower's cooperation with unions, Eisenhower's cooperation with the New Deal coalition that largely voted for him, even though he was a Republican,
Yes.
really influenced Nixon in his presidential campaign and then presidential terms, because he still believed that a government, a divided government, could still work. This
Hmm.
because this was the days before partisanship had become such that members were instructed by their party leadership not to cooperate with each other on anything. This was still doable. And so, yes, when you mention Nixon and his creation of the EPA and his creation of OSHA,
Hmm.
organizations that are very pro union, or at least the interests that unions also have in the Democratic Party. But Nixon, at the same time, yeah, it admitted that the sands were shifting, and that he was not necessarily going to have to be beholden to unions in
Yes.
ways that other presidents before him had been. And I think that Reagan actually learned a lot about how he was going to take apart unions from Nixon,
Makes
and the
sense.
Republican Party did,
Hmm.
because Nixon's secrecy, his paranoia, and his cooperation was really, in the end, his downfall, because he was not trusted by other Republicans who say he's giving too much to the Democrats.
Hmm.
And of course, he's not being trusted by the Democrats because they've proven that he's trying to spy on them.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that Reagan took from that is, you know, you don't have to cooperate. If you run and hold the levers of power,
Hmm.
enough people in the legislature to block a supermajority, you don't have to cooperate technically with the Democratic minority leadership in Congress. You
Hmm.
can just do what you want, and as long as the American people don't don't come after you, then you really have free reign and can basically justify any action you decide to take, as long as the American people don't absolutely come unglued.
Yes.
And
Okay.
and Reagan was very careful with how he presented himself. So he
Hmm.
always came off as somebody who the American people thought, oh, he's not such a bad guy, even if they disagreed with him politically.
Okay.
So I mean, I think you're right on about a lot of the characteristics of those presidents and their legacies.
Okay. I'm really enjoying this. So I don't know. I might need to do an episode just on, because from like presidents from Kennedy to Reagan, because I feel like that mid-century, 20th century like presidents probably the most consequential run of presidents ever,
It,
honestly.
it it's very important, and it's very important to understand our particular situation right now.
Yes. Hmm.
Um, for all the people who say that we could be looking at a Grover Cleveland situation, Grover Cleveland, famously only president to serve non-consecutive terms.
Hmm.
Grover Cleveland, Benjamin Harrison, Grover Cleveland again.
Okay.
And they think this might be possible with Trump because he might be able to drum up support
Hmm.
from a lot of his constituents, and rebrand himself and capitalize on some issues of the Biden administration, some that are in their control, some that are outside their control. Namely, the virus, doesn't necessarily play favorites with any political party. It's not going to stop being a problem just because Joe Biden is president instead of
Hmm.
Donald Trump. But I I think that um, if you look back at the presidents basically from 50 onward,
Yes.
so Eisenhower and then Kennedy, Nixon,
Hmm.
and then shortly Ford, but then Jimmy Carter also I think is a fascinating study for
Hmm.
people for politics, because he was his presidency had some of the most promise that the Democrats um, ever even considered
Hmm.
at the time. You have to remember that Jimmy Carter, unlike a lot of these other guys, was not a political, animal, and wasn't really involved in a lot of the leadership of the Democratic Party. He was
Hmm.
just a peanut farmer who happened to win the governorship of Georgia, and then, came basically out of nowhere to become
Hmm.
president. He was on no one's short list for the nomination. And the spectacular failure of the Carter administration, again, some things in his control,
Uh-huh.
um, and some things out of his control, namely the Iran hostage crisis or
Hmm.
the U.S. Embargo by OPEC on oil, and economic stagflation that had been basically in the works since before he was president, all the way back at the end of World War II, when we had the Bretton Woods Convention, and the whole world decided that the U.S. dollar was going to be the world's um, backing currency, basically taking the place of like gold. The U.S. dollar is basically gold to the other nations of the world. But I mention all of this only to say that
Hmm.
this period that you're talking about is, I think, he probably doesn't need to have an episode, if not maybe a couple, on
Yeah.
the presidents who
Uh-huh.
make it up, because they are so important to really get a sense of why things are the way they are now, which I
Hmm.
think is a question that people who are developing a political consciousness university students that are really being exposed to this for the first time, because this is
Hmm.
not something that is taught at the secondary education level in high school, and it's
No,
certainly not taught at a primary level.
no.
And politics and political thinking and political history is something that the education system tries to stay really far away from in the primary and secondary fields, because they don't want to anger parents, is
Hmm.
the main difference. And then you get to the university and suddenly you're inundated with all of this um, new information that basically heretofore has been not prohibited from you, but kind of censored by the providers of your education if you went through the public school system in the United States. And so
Hmm.
I think that you know, people who are like, why is it like this?
Hmm.
I think you could really do a lot for them with explaining in detail how these men shaped the current situation that we find ourselves in the
Hmm.
world, in America's place in the world.
Yeah. It's funny that you bring up the education doesn't teach this, because like I went to Jefferson High School here in Shenandoah Junction. It went from we spent like a whole 9 weeks from of with Columbus to the Revolutionary War, like that period. Spent a whole 9 weeks on that, and then we spent a good chunk of the year about we almost skipped World War I,
Hmm.
anyways. But and then we'll go from that um to Revolutionary War to the Civil War, and spend a long time on that,
Hmm.
and then
Absolutely.
skip World War I, spend almost the rest of the year on World War II.
Hmm.
All right. And then by then you're in springtime. So spring break, and then you get back in like early early April. Talk a little bit more about the Civil War.
Hmm.
Talk maybe like 2 or 3 weeks on World War I. Spend almost the rest of the year on World War II. And then after that, it's 2 weeks to learn about 1950 to today.
Hmm.
So it's like, so when you actually get time for yourself to learn about these times, and specifically those like five men that were president from 1950 to now, it's almost mind-boggling, because it's like, why didn't anyone tell me this? And it wasn't that long ago. So you would think like a teacher would have some, or a school system would have some type of like excitement to talk about it. You know what I mean? Because they lived
But
through. Yeah.
what would you like to know why that is the way it is?
Yeah.
I think your listeners would really find this interesting.
Mm-hmm.
There's two reasons
Mm-hmm.
why basically your history went the way it did.
Mm-hmm.
One is um, textbooks are expensive,
Yes.
and so the textbooks that you probably using are
Mm-hmm.
at least 30 years old.
Mm-hmm.
So they don't go far enough into the present to really be in a place to analyze, events from mid-century onward,
Mm-hmm.
which is why it's such a short period. And then at the secondary level, American history is very narratively focused.
Mm-hmm.
You Some high schools are pretty progressive. They might have some interrogation of primary source documents and
Mm-hmm.
drawing your own conclusions and critical thinking, but more often than not, in most school systems in the United States, um, when it comes to American history, there are narratives that are put forward because they're easy to teach to students. And I personally believe they do a great disservice to students, because either you get oversimplification
Mm-hmm.
of really complex um, periods, like you mentioned World War I, incredibly complicated, so complicated, in fact, that people don't talk about it because they don't know if they can talk confidently about it,
Mm-hmm.
because there's so many moving parts and there's not really, um, people or pivotal events that you can point to like you could with World War II. Um, when explain to explain it to high schoolers that you know have a lot of other classes they're taking at the
Yeah.
same time, and
Mhm.
their attention is divided. So they need to really get this message to their students in a way that's easily digestible, and the way that has traditionally been done is by advancing narratives of the United States and American history. um, the two probably biggest ones are that the is the American dream, and
Mhm.
that the idea that anyone can rise, as far as their talents can take them in this country, if you
Mhm.
if you work hard. And the other is the ascendancy of the United States, that American life and society has been on a continual upward trajectory and
Mhm.
will um, continue along that upward trajectory. When, if you look out right now at the world, it doesn't match up to what the narratives are that the American education system still is promoting and has been promoting for 30, 40 years,
Mhm.
which is why you have a lot of skepticism among those students that think a little bit more about what it is they're learning in school, and why is it so different than what I'm seeing on the news every night.
Yes.
So I think that you know um, it's part of the nature of mass education,
Mhm.
is this idea of narratives, and they are an easy way to put um, evidence before, or put a story before a student that they can understand easily.
Mhm.
um, and I did, and what, in our class I did include a narrative history of the United States, but we also supplemented that with lecture. And
Mhm.
that's because I wanted to give students a chance to see a narrative history that they could use, something they're
Yes.
comfortable with. But also, if they listen to the lectures and our class discussions, then
Mhm.
they would also get a sense of the fact that there's multiple interpretations of the same events, because I'm sure I
Mhm.
I did not cover everything the same way that the textbook did in
Yes.
class. And so um, I think that students deserve to be able to think for themselves, and so
Mhm.
they deserve to have multiple methods of analyzing history when they're trying to understand it.
Mhm. Thank you for that, by the way. Um, um, I'm trying to wrap this
Sure.
conversation up because we gotta get back to
Absolutely.
unions. But anyways, thank you for that because um we were talking about um the Theodore Roosevelt administration and the Panama Canal, the creation of the Panama Canal, and you were talking about the how the creation of the country of Panama was directly made from the United States to from Colombia.
Yes.
Yeah, from
Yeah.
Colombia. Uh, they did not. I remember in high school, middle school. I learned this a couple times in school. The creation of the Panama Canal. They never brought up America's involvement in the creation of Panama.
Yeah.
So thank you for that, because that's like a different viewpoint of it. Because they only usually gave us one in high school. It was rah rah America.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Back to unions.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So this kind of ties back to of course, the hard hats versus the hippies. But anyways, okay. Even the Democratic Party is criticized for abandoning union members and economic issues for a whole, in place of culture war issues instead of economic issues and social issues. Is this a good strategy considering that union membership is declining and they're taking advantage of how strongly people feel about cultural issues?
So here's what I'd say to that.
Mhm.
um Political parties are, at their very core, interested in one thing, and that's getting reelected.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
So both the Republicans and the Democrats and the parties before them, and probably the parties after them,
Mhm.
uh, will create basically a playbook how are we going to win, elections? And the Democratic Party made a decision in the 60s, basically, that
Mhm.
they were going to hitch um, their future to social issues like race, like
Mhm.
gender equality, um, and therefore they thought that they could spend less time appealing to uh, the American working class, and therefore a lot of the membership of the unions who are white ethnics
Mhm.
that we talked about previously.
Mhm.
And I think that history will show that that was the right decision.
Mm.
That
Okay.
valuing those issues was a prudent decision,
Mhm.
um, despite the fact that the kinds of policies that they were advocating for would not be satisfying to anyone who's currently alive today and politically active in the new generation. They just wouldn't accept that as going far enough, basically. But um but I the Democratic Party, I think, is will be shown to be the smart one for making this choice, but it caused a lot of pain
Yes.
with the breakup of the coalition.
Mhm.
and and I think that part of this was the playbook, but I think part of this also was the um humanity of some of the members of the Democratic Party in acknowledging that these are issues that the party needs to take seriously, because they really could have continued their dominance and not addressed those issues of civil rights, of
Mhm.
you know gender equality, um, even more recently, the issues of civil unions versus marriages that we talked about just
Mhm.
recently.
Yeah.
Taking on these social issues, and so the social acceptance of previously marginalized groups,
Mhm.
um, is prudent decision making, because as the demographics of the United States change,
Mhm.
the thinking is that those groups, as they become larger, will repay that um, goodwill that was given to them by the Democratic Party by supporting the party and helping to fill it out. And I think that that's playing the long game, and that I think that strategy will probably end up being successful for them. It certainly seems like there's a lot of goodwill on their side now.
Mhm.
So I did that help answer your question?
Yeah,
I
that
kind of
helped answer my question. Um, so I'm honestly gonna have to disagree with that.
okay.
I don't think it does because um labor unions are, I think, the backbone of any economic policy in the United States. And I think that the Democrat, I'm full disclosure, I'm a Democrat. That's
Okay.
probably not surprising. I'm young, I'm black, I'm half Hispanic. I go to college. Of course, you probably knew that. Anyways, um, so I'm gonna vote Democrat. Most minorities are gonna vote Democrat
Mhm.
regardless. Um, but besides that, I feel that Democratic Party could be even more dominant if they kept the social issues but didn't forget the economic issues, because I feel like Democratic Party of 2021 is almost all social issues instead of the economic issues. And so then people like Trump can, fill that void, that fake void, because he wasn't a true economic populist. He did pretty
Mhm.
much the same things like a President Ricky Rubio would have done or
Yeah.
whatever. Anyways, um, so if they would have kept both labor issues and the social issues, and
Mhm.
then maybe even, because you need both, I think, for the Democratic Party to work, but it seems like now it's just social issues because
Mhm.
um many of these Democrats, like President Joe Biden, he's from Delaware. That's one of the strong states for like credit card companies.
Yeah, there's
And
a lot of tax exemptions
yes,
in
tax exempt.
Delaware.
Hillary Clinton was on the board of Walmart. And like voters are not like dumb, like they do a little more research than people think they do. And then they see this and they're asked, yeah, you're cool to black people and you're nice to gay people and Hispanics, like, but what are you going to do for me economically? And if
Mhm.
the answer is, well, we support Black Lives Matter, a lot of people, even ethnic minorities, like the Hispanic vote was surprisingly, they still voted overwhelmingly for Joe Biden, but it was still closer, the margins for Biden and Trump. And
Mhm.
then if you look at the amount of people, black people and Hispanic people and young people that just don't vote because they don't see a difference why. Because it's like, because even on social issues, they might switch up, because it just seems like when they forgot that half of politics is social and economic, and they just went straight social issues instead of economic issues. That's when they kind of lost the plot, in my opinion, and kind of lost their reason to be. Um, yeah, so I would have to
Uh,
disagree with you there. I don't
yeah,
think that they built too much goodwill, as more as that they're not Republicans, so therefore we're going to vote for them regardless. You know what I mean?
yeah, okay. No, I appreciate the challenge
Mm-hmm.
and your evidence is compelling. I agree with a lot of things you said.
Mm-hmm.
Um, my defense, I guess, of myself would
Mm-hmm.
be uh something that I've learned as a historian and kind of dealing with kind of the graduate level interrogation of like historical theory that we do. And
Mm-hmm.
that is, I agree that Americans are not dumb and that they want to know what they're going to be done, what's going to be done for them economically.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a real difference in the United States and elsewhere in the world,
Mm-hmm.
specifically Europe, when we look at the expression of historical thought. And
Yes.
so there's this idea of the third rail,
Mm-hmm.
and in the United States, the third rail is race, okay,
Okay. Mm-hmm.
and in Europe, the third rail is class.
Yes.
Things you're talking about
Mm-hmm.
are really present in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's why Europe has such a rich tapestry of economic styles. You have, the Nordic countries that are,
Mm-hmm.
um, overwhelmingly socialist, and all of, Denmark with its happiness index and like all this, progressive economic policy that exists in Europe, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then in the United States, they ask, why can't that exist?
Mm-hmm.
And the issue is race, but they consider it race, but I would say what's really going on is tribalism.
Mm-hmm.
Americans have been divided into all these subgroups, okay?
Okay.
And as long as they don't come together,
Mm-hmm.
business wins.
Yes.
Right now, what's going on in the tech industry is essentially what was going on at the turn of the century with regards to heavy industry.
Mm-hmm.
Companies like Amazon, um, and Google and Facebook, these absolutely behemoth companies in terms of their economic value, in a dollars and cents analysis. If we look at the stock market and things like that,
Mm-hmm.
this kind of very alien way of for common Americans to think of economic issues and economic power.
Mm-hmm.
Those companies claim to be these, huge progressive, we're going to, convert our fleet to carbon neutral. We're
Mm-hmm.
going to plant trees. We're going to be more transparent about, how we deal with your data, all
Mm-hmm.
that stuff. but at the end of the day, they're still corporations,
Yeah.
very large corporations,
Hmm.
and how they have not been targeted by Sherman antitrust legislation is absolutely baffling to me. It's because
Hmm.
Congress refuses to invoke that legislation because they get such, because Amazon is so cozy with a lot, or Amazon, the tech
Hmm.
industries. I think of Amazon as like chief among them,
Yeah, me
but the
too.
tech industries as really cozy with government, which is not a
Hmm.
coincidence. They did that
Yeah.
on purpose,
Yes.
but also because um, these tech companies know that as long as if that their existence and their continued dominance
Hmm.
of the United States and the American economy is contingent upon not being seen in the same light as those turn of the century gigantic monopoly companies like Standard Oil or American Steel. Um, and I mean, the parallels are uncanny, and someone could write a fantastic dissertation on
Hmm.
that, or a master's thesis
Yeah.
um, on the parallels between industry at the turn of the last century and then industry at the turn of this century,
Hmm.
because they're very similar and striking. But I mean, I agree with you that the Democrats really need both fists for that,
Hmm.
the social issues and the economic issues. But
Hmm.
I just think that the way that voter consciousness exists right now,
Hmm.
until a coalition is formed, um, that may happen in our lifetimes. I mean, there's a lot of cross pollination going on right now between different groups that have historically been on the margins politically.
Hmm.
If that continues, then maybe, one day there can be a coalition of uh, social groups with groups that are primarily interested in economic equality.
Yes.
But until that day, Americans remain really fractured,
Hmm.
and you can win elections. Um, you can win elections without the economic issue, because you don't have to do it. And the
Hmm.
Democratic leadership, for all its social progressivism, those people also are part of the political and economic elite of this country,
Yes.
and it is also in their best interest uh, and not to bring too many policies to the table that seek to level the playing field between the um, the people who have and the people who have not.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah. I like how you brought up the coalition, that there could one day maybe be a coalition that could bring about this. The best example of that would be the Sanders campaign, but of course he lost twice. So I think with Sanders, I think it was just too much too soon. It is funny because like at the time, if you would have told me that, I wouldn't believe you, but it's true. Like you need to have a certain sense of a coalition that had to be built beforehand. Like movements just don't arise by one person. And well, yeah, go ahead.
No, I agree with you. Sanders is unique, and
Hmm.
Sanders, the supporters of Sanders really had the had that kind of feeling of a coalition
Hmm.
across social divide, but also an economic divide.
Hmm.
Um, but the problem with the Sanders campaign that he ran into is that to become president, you still need um, the approval of the one of the two political parties, the
Yeah.
major political parties in the United
Hmm.
States. And like the other side of that coin is Donald Trump,
Hmm.
and Donald Trump was able to, get the approval of the Republican Party to be their candidate. And had he not gotten it, he would have split the vote with whoever their nominee was, like Roosevelt did with Taft
Hmm.
and the Bull Moose Party. But Sanders could have done the same thing and split the vote
Hmm.
with Hillary and with Joe Biden
Yes.
if he had chose to run as a third party. and
Mm-hmm.
he has a lot of independent qualities to him, which is one of the reasons he's so admired by people who are not normally politically active, but they say, if Bernie Sanders is on the ballot, I will vote for him.
Mm-hmm.
um, but there's still gatekeepers in the Democratic Party, and they just don't think that Americans can do what you're suggesting they do, which is
Mm-hmm.
to use both social and economic issues as reasons for electing a president, to advance those policies.
Mm-hmm.
They don't think that can happen. And so, they kind of put the kibosh on his viability in those races,
Mm-hmm.
because they and their delegates that vote, the way that the Democratic Party tells them to vote, we're
Yes.
not going to support Bernie Sanders. I firmly believe that he had the vote of the um, American people, or at least a large group
Yes.
of the American people.
Mm-hmm.
But basically, they didn't put him out to see what was going to happen. They didn't feel comfortable. They went with safe bets. They
Yes.
went with Hillary Clinton, wife of Bill Clinton,
Mm-hmm.
president, and the fact that they're in the inner circle of the Democratic Party. Joe Biden, a longtime political creature,
Mm-hmm.
and had all these connections in the leadership of the Democratic Party and in Congress, where he had served for a long time. And so Bernie Sanders is a great example of somebody who could embody those qualities, but
Mm-hmm.
he ran into a buzzsaw in establishment candidates that had a lot of connections.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I volunteered for the Sanders campaign in 2020,
Mhm.
and I was a diehard Bernie supporter, and thought I knew 2016 was going to be hard. I knew 2020 was going to be hard for him to win, but after he won New Hampshire, I think it was New Hampshire, I was like, oh, he's going to win this. But I think,
And then South Carolina happened.
yeah, the South Carolina happened, and I think a lot of people on the left, me included, underestimated just how important it is to get your candidate out there. And it does. And I used to get really annoyed when people said, crazy Bernie, he can't win. Crazy Bernie, he can't win. And they kind of proved that right in a way, because I think if you put his policies out and the regular person will say, yeah, I like this. But the media does play a big role. And of course, like you said, the establishment of a party plays a big role too. So part of this show is trying to figure out what could be that can break through, that is like digestible to, I don't know, like an MSNBC watcher, and um like an upper class Democrat, because that wasn't his strong suit, upper class Democrats and black Democrats. But like, what is a digestible version of Bernie Sanders? And I don't know, there's not really an answer to that, and it's probably going to take many years of coalition building. um I hope to help in that. I hope to be in the political field after college.
Mhm.
um so yeah, that's hard. I don't have the answer to that, because a lot of
Well,
people
I
say AOC, but I don't. But that's besides the point. Yeah.
well, I think there's a very prescient moment regarding Bernie Sanders.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I forget where it was that this happened, but he was being cheered in some kind of arena,
Mm-hmm.
and he kind of, Bernie, and he kind of
Yes.
stopped them and he said, "Not me, us,
Mm-hmm.
not me, us." And I think that is really the game, because Bernie Sanders is an us candidate,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yes.
And Joe Biden is a me candidate.
Yes.
I'm not saying that I'm not trying to make cast aspersions on Joe Biden's character, but
Mm-hmm.
his model is very in the style of a me candidate, someone that you can look at and say, this is our president. and this is how presidents act, and
Mhm.
this is how presidents operate. Um, it is my decision. I am the decision maker. Bernie Sanders, when he did that, he basically said, to the American people that, like, I'm on the same level with you. And Americans, I think, are still stuck in this idea that their president has to be like more than human almost.
Yes.
He has to be this symbol that you can
Mhm.
look to and say, he's the president, he knows what he's doing. He has the best people on it. But but I think that Bernie Sanders, when he did that, that was incredibly brave, politically speaking, to do
Mhm.
that, because he's basically acknowledging that, I have my own foibles, and, I might not always make the right decision, but,
Mhm.
this is not about me. This campaign is not about me. This is about
Mhm.
the American people. And that's a message that they have not heard before. A mainstream, in the
Yeah.
mainstream, they've
Mhm.
not heard before a candidate express that. And so I think that Americans are going to need some time to get
Yes.
used to someone who
Mhm.
talks that way and believes
Mhm.
those things. And so you mentioned AOC,
Mhm.
and she's an important member of the new political class that's entering
Mhm.
politics at this time from our generations. But I think that, again, it's going to be time, and maybe someone like that, or someone from the next generation, is going to reap the benefits that Bernie Sanders laid when he ran his presidential campaigns, where he had buy-in from people like
Mhm.
you, who
Yes.
just are e- excited about the possibilities of this country,
Mhm.
when we all work together,
Yes.
right?
Mhm.
I mean, I'm assuming that's what drew you to the campaign.
Yes, it is. Yes.
Yeah.
And I bring him up a lot in this show because he has a lot of purchase with young people, and he
Hmm.
was like one of those once in a lifetime candidates that maybe like Goldwater we didn't know at the time had a big, impact, but
Hmm.
because he didn't win, of course, Bernie didn't win. So hopefully one day people are looking back and it's like, oh, President da 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 is in the mode of Bernie, which Bernie's in the mode of FDR. So then maybe this can all come full circle, and but that's just, I don't know, maybe a leftist pipe dream. So yeah. All right. Back to the last question.
Okay.
All right, back to unions. I know that may have felt
Yeah,
like
no, that's fine.
we could
What you
go.
got for me?
Yeah. It's a long episode, but I'm really enjoying this. So it's probably the longest yet. Anyways, um, with the large teachers union strikes across many red states in 2018, do you see a resurgence of union activity in the near future?
Oh, that's a great question.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I would have said that a teacher strike in a state like West Virginia
Mm-hmm.
was pretty much impossible, because the governor and the Congress, would would not allow it. They would figure out a way to keep the schools open. They would, divide and conquer. But I was very surprised by the um, leadership of those teachers unions.
Mm-hmm.
And teachers unions, unlike a lot of other unions, um, are not something that is easily broken, because they can't you can't move their jobs overseas, and
Mm-hmm.
basically eliminate their existence economically in this country. People need to be taught, and will continue to need to be taught. And you're not going to be able to go to Bangladesh, or Malaysia, to do it. So that gives teachers kind of an advantage that a lot of other unions don't have. And I think that unionism it is not what it once was.
No.
It is absolutely not what it
Hmm.
once was. I mean, if you dispute that, read Jefferson Cowie's book, Last Days of the Working Class. I mentioned it already. It's pretty systematic, the collapse of unionism, but it does still exist in pockets of this country.
Hmm.
And I think that exposure is probably the best way to get the message of unions out, because I
Hmm.
think that young people, they think of unions in this very historical context, like it was something that happened,
Yes.
in days when people fell into smelters at steel mills, and
Yeah.
their wife got like, you know, a coupon for dinner the next night at the company restaurant, and
Hmm.
and maybe some flowers or something.
Hmm.
They don't think of it as like a living, breathing thing that exists and that they have been involved with. Because if you're a student, or have ever been in public schools and basically weren't homeschooled, and that's a lot of Americans, you've had interactions with people who are involved with unions.
Hmm.
And if you have any respect for your teachers at all and what they do, then you're going to notice that, you know, hey, this organization does is able to affect change,
Hmm.
something not nearly probably the change that is hoped for, but is able to do something. And so I think that just the recognition of the existence of unions,
Yes.
um, by young people, makes them go, oh my god, yeah, that's a great idea. We
Hmm.
There should be some sort of body that talks to the employer, on your behalf, to negotiate a better deal for you.
Hmm.
It makes common sense, which
Yeah.
is the best kind of sense.
Hmm. Yeah, I remember the West Virginia teachers strike here in West Virginia, of
Yeah.
course, West Virginia teacher strike. Uh, I remember a lot of people on Twitter my age were tweeting things in support of the teachers, and this is a red state. It is. I was gonna say supposedly a red state. This is a definite red state, but it made me like, I don't know, made my heart grow three sizes. You
Like the
know,
Grinch.
yeah, to see people give such love to a union for one, and then a teachers union. People, they love their teachers,
Mhm.
supposedly, because I wish they got paid like they loved them. But anyways, yeah, yeah, it was good just to see people appreciate workers' movement
Mhm.
in in the 21st century. And that just, it was probably one of the few times where I was like really proud to be a West Virginian, was to see those teachers on strike. Um, I want to leave this episode on a really happy note.
That's
And
that's good. They usually
yeah,
don't end on happy
yeah,
notes
right.
when we talk about
Yeah,
politics.
it's one of the few times I did an episode on Iraq with my international relations professor, and
Okay.
like the episode ended like talking about the fallout of the Iraq war and like death and destruction. So I'm happy that this episode actually ends on me being proud and happy.
Yeah, let me tell you, Christian, I do Native American history. That is
Yeah.
my uh my field. And
Hmm.
there's almost no conversation that goes on in that field that ends on a happy note.
Yeah.
There's really not. So I'm glad I can contribute to this episode ending on a happy note.
uh yeah, an actual, not a not a forced, like I don't know, forced optimism. This is real optimism, and like this is geared toward young people, politics is kind to young people. I think you can agree with that.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem like there's a lot for us or whatever. So yeah, I would want to end on that good note. That's, yeah, go teachers, go unions. Yeah. Well,
And know
this was
your
a lot of
history.
fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, and go history. Yeah, know your history. And know that history is, you would agree with this, history just never ends. And things might seem permanent now, but it won't always be this way. And maybe we can change it for the better, because it's might seem like it's too late, but I don't know. That's
That's
the thing about
always
time.
that's always the goal with history. It's called the that noble dream. that
Yeah.
you can learn from history and therefore impact the future. That's kind of the ultimate goal of the field.
Noble dream. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Anything to say? Anything to plug?
No, Christian, I just want to say how happy I am that you asked me to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just very impressed with your, you know, style and your evidence, and
Mm-hmm.
you're just an outstanding example of a
Thank
Shepherd
you.
student in many ways. And
Thank you so much.
I really um support Shepherd so
Mm-hmm.
much because it changed my life
Mm-hmm.
so dramatically. And so when I see people who are excited about learning, it
Mm-hmm.
just really warms my heart also, Grinch like,
Yeah.
because it's just, that's so important, and it will carry, it carries you on to the next chapter of your life. And in this
Mm-hmm.
case, it sounds like it's going to be politics. And so I hope you take, what you learned at Shepherd, and your optimism about education, and yeah, you're just all the lessons you learned at Shepherd, and applying them out in the world. And I think that you're going to be a great ambassador for the university. So I'm
Thank you
glad I
so
got a
much. That
chance
means a
to talk
lot.
to you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah. Thank you for coming on. And the book is Last Days of the American Working Class, correct?
that is right, by Jefferson Cowie.
Jefferson Calorie. Okay. Yeah. Do I see you Monday? Do we have class on Monday?
We do have class on Monday. It's our last week, and we are talking about uh, not really necessarily history.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to talk about Obama and his presidency and the challenges that he endured, and
Okay.
then we'll really briefly touch on the 2016 election, and like kind of the change in
Mhm.
uh, tone, and the fact, well, exactly, facts,
Yes.
and whether or not facts are objective
Mm-hmm.
in today's political climate, especially.
Yes.
So it's going to
Thank
be
you.
an interesting week, and it's going to be a lot of discussion. And so I'm hoping that we can um, have some good conversations about it. So
All right. Cool.
that's what's
Thank you.
that's what's coming down the pipe for
Yeah.
things.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, everybody, that's our episode. Thank you, Dr. Stark Harvard. Is it doctor yet?
No, it's not
Not yet.
doctor yet,
Right.
but
Yeah.
I don't correct people because I like the way it sounds.
Sounds right. Yeah. Yeah. I see. You know what? On my podcast is doctor. So
Okay.
thank
Well,
you, Dr. Stark Harbor.
thank you very much. I enjoyed it thoroughly.
Yes, me too. Me too. This is a great episode. Okay. Um, I'll see you. I'll see you Monday.
I will see you Monday, Christian. You
All right.
have a good rest of your weekend, okay?
You too. Thank you so much.
No problem. Take
All right.
care.
Bye bye. Take care.
Bye.